They were hanged in chains, left to rot in iron cages suspended above the Thames, so every sailor entering London could see what waited for them if they chose the black flag. Their bodies stayed there for years, sometimes decades. It was called gibbeting, and it was not the worst thing that could happen to you. History taught you about pirates through a very comfortable filter. The tricorn hats, the parrots, the treasure maps, the swashbuckling romance of life on the open water. What history skipped over, what the textbooks quietly set aside, was what happened when the golden age of piracy collided with the full weight of imperial justice. And what happened was something so systematic, so deliberately theatrical, so calculatedly brutal that it staggers the modern mind. We are not talking about simple execution. Execution would have been a mercy. What the courts of England, Spain, Portugal, and the Dutch Republic designed for captured pirates was something more sophisticated than death. It was a message, a performance, a warning written in human flesh that was meant to be read by every sailor, every merchant, every colonial subject who might consider whether the pirate's life was worth the risk. By the time we are done today, you will understand why the golden age of piracy ended, not because the pirates ran out of courage, but because the empires found punishments so extreme, so public, so impossible to ignore that the math simply stopped working in favor of the black flag. You will understand what gibbeting actually smelled like and why it was placed where it was. You will understand what the rope does to a human body and why pirates laughed about it, because the alternative was to be terrified. Stay with us, because the fates worse than death are exactly where we are going. Before we talk about the punishments, we need to understand the world that invented them, because without that context, the brutality seems random. It was not random. It was architecture. The late 17th and early 18th centuries represented the single greatest expansion of maritime trade in human history. Spain was pulling silver out of the Americas by the shipload. England was building a colonial empire that stretched across 3 oceans. The Dutch East India Company was essentially a corporate nation-state with its own fleet, its own soldiers, and its own courts. The Atlantic was not just water. It was the circulatory system of the most profitable economic machine the world had ever seen, and pirates were a clot in that system. When a pirate took a merchant vessel, he was not just stealing cargo. He was disrupting the flow of capital that funded wars, built navies, and financed governments. The empires understood this clearly. A pirate was not merely a criminal. A pirate was an economic insurgent, and he needed to be dealt with as one. The legal framework that emerged was called Admiralty law. Admiralty courts did not require a jury of peers the way common law courts did. They were faster, more military in character, and significantly less interested in the niceties of reasonable doubt. When Parliament passed the Act for the More Effectual Suppression of Piracy in 1700, they created a system of military tribunals that could be convened anywhere in the empire, try pirates on the spot, and execute them within days of capture. This mattered because the empire understood something important, that the timing of punishment is as important as the punishment itself. If you catch a pirate in the Caribbean and send him back to London for trial, the spectacle occurs thousands of miles from where the piracy happened. The 1700 Act eliminated that problem. Trial and execution could now happen in Nassau, in Port Royal, in the very harbors where the pirates had operated. The audience was exactly who the state wanted to frighten. And frightening was precisely what they intended to do. The journey toward execution began with capture, and capture was itself often a brutal ordeal that left men broken before they ever saw a courtroom. Naval vessels pursuing pirates were ordered to use whatever force was necessary. In practice, this meant that many pirates never made it to trial at all. Ships that refused to surrender, that continued fighting after it was clearly hopeless, were sometimes simply destroyed. Sailors caught in the water were not always pulled out. This was not officially sanctioned murder. It was the ambiguity of combat, and everyone understood what it meant. Those who were taken alive found themselves in irons within minutes. Pirates were chained in the lowest decks of naval vessels in spaces not designed for human habitation, fed minimally, exposed to bilge water sloshing around the hull. The voyage back to port could take weeks or months. But by the time prisoners arrived at trial, some were already half dead from what was essentially casual cruelty. There was no formal policy of torture at this stage. There did not need to be. What interrogation was actually designed to do was identify the social structure of the crew. Who was the captain? Who had committed specific acts of violence against prisoners? This mattered because the punishments were tiered according to culpability, at least in theory. Leaders and the most violent offenders were treated differently from ordinary crew members. That theory was applied inconsistently. Many ordinary sailors who had done nothing except sail under a black flag found themselves on the gallows alongside the men who had ordered murders. The courts were not always interested in fine distinctions. They were interested in the message, and the message required numbers. The piracy trials of the Golden Age were not legal proceedings in any modern sense. They were theatrical performances with predetermined conclusions, staged for the benefit of the colonial merchant class and the sailors who watched from the harbor. The judges who presided over admiralty courts were appointed by the Crown, paid by the Crown, and understood that their purpose was to efficiently process captured pirates into executed ones. Defense counsel was available in theory and often absent in practice. Witnesses for the defense were difficult to summon across oceanic distances. In most cases, the trial lasted a single day. Under the 1700 Act, anyone who had been present on a pirate vessel, regardless of their specific role, could be convicted of piracy. Sailors who had been captured by pirates and forced to serve, men who had genuinely been victims, sometimes found themselves convicted alongside their captors. The courts occasionally recognized this and acquitted such men. Occasionally, the most famous mass trial of the Golden Age was the prosecution of Bartholomew Roberts's crew following his death in battle in 1722. Black Bart had been the most successful pirate of the entire era, capturing over 400 vessels in his career. When HMS Swallow caught his fleet off the coast of West Africa, Roberts was killed in the initial engagement, and his crew of some 260 men was taken prisoner. The trial at Cape Coast Castle processed those men with extraordinary efficiency. In the end, 52 were hanged, 17 sent to prison, on 70 sentenced to labor in the slave trade, and the rest acquitted or transported. The entire proceeding took a matter of weeks. Those 52 who were hanged were not all executed in the same way or the same place, and that distinction tells you everything about what the state was actually trying to accomplish. The primary execution site for pirates in England was Execution Dock at Wapping on the north bank of the Thames. The location was chosen with absolute deliberateness. Wapping was the heart of London's maritime district, where sailors came and went, where captains hired their crews, where the dockside taverns did their business. Everyone connected to the sea passed through Wapping. Execution Dock was visible from the river. Ships sailing toward the Pool of London would see it. This was the point. But the method of execution at Wapping was hanging by a shortened rope. This is significant because the standard executioner's practice had moved toward what was called the long drop, a method designed to break the neck at the moment the condemned fell, causing rapid unconsciousness and death. The short rope used at Wapping did not break the neck. It strangled. Death came slowly over several minutes as the airway was compressed and blood flow to the brain was interrupted. The dying person would convulse, kick, their face would darken and swell, and the entire process was visible to the crowd below in considerable detail. Sailors called it the Marshal's Dance, a black humor reference to the way the dying man's legs moved. Pirates sometimes adopted a performance of courage around execution, walking to the gallows in their finest clothes, on delivering speeches that mixed bravado with theological observation. Some were genuinely composed, some were not, and the record of those who were not is difficult to read. Accounts of men weeping, begging, calling for their mothers in languages the crowd did not speak. The crowds were large and mixed. Working people, merchants, sailors, children, street vendors selling food, and broadsheets. The broadsheets extended the spectacle far beyond the crowd actually present. Execution narratives were among the most popular publications of the era, sold for a penny apiece, describing the crimes, the trial, and frequently a last speech, whether or not any such speech had actually been given. The state was learning to use mass media to amplify the message the gallows was sending, but the gallows was not the end of the story. For the most notorious pirates, death was only the beginning. After execution, the bodies of prominent pirate leaders were subjected to a process called gibbeting, a punishment applied to a corpse and one of the most psychologically sophisticated forms of deterrence that early modern statecraft produced. After a pirate was hanged, his body was taken down and given to a tarman whose job was to cover it in liquid tar. The tar preserved the soft tissue, slowing decomposition significantly, though not stopping it. The tarred body was then fitted into a custom-made iron cage shaped roughly to the dimensions of the dead man. This cage was hoisted on a tall post in a prominent location and left there, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. The locations were selected for their visibility. To Tilbury Point at the mouth of the Thames was a common sight. Every vessel sailing in or out of London would pass these displays. Caribbean colonies had their own gibbet sites, usually positioned on headlands at the entrances to harbors where they would be visible to incoming ships. The message to sailors was not abstract, it was extremely literal. This is what we do with pirates. This is what they look like afterward. The most famous gibbet case was that of William Kidd, hanged at Execution Dock in May 1701, whose tarred body was subsequently suspended at Tilbury Point for 3 years. Captain Kidd's case remains controversial. He had been commissioned as a privateer operating with the blessing of prominent Whig politicians, and his conviction was entangled in political maneuvering that had more to do with English factional politics than with anything he had actually done. None of this changed what happened to his body. The physical reality of a gibbeted corpse needs to be acknowledged directly. The tar slowed but did not stop decomposition. Over months, the body would shrink and blacken further. Birds would take what the tar did not protect. By the time a gibbet had been up for a year, what hung in it looked nothing like a human being in any comfortable sense. It was a darkness, a shape, a thing that moved in the wind and creaked against its iron cage. The smell, in warm weather and close proximity, was considerable. Children growing up in maritime communities in the early 18th century grew up with gibbets on the horizon as part of the natural landscape. This was entirely intentional. The state wanted the association between piracy and this particular end to be established so early and so deeply that it became instinctive. You did not choose the black flag without knowing viscerally what you were choosing. Not every captured pirate was hanged and gibbeted. The Admiralty courts had a range of options, and the lesser punishments sometimes represented a different kind of horror. Transportation sent convicted pirates to work as enslaved laborers in the colonies. Some were sent to English plantation colonies in the Caribbean, where they were assigned to the most dangerous labor available, clearing swampland, cutting sugarcane, or working the indigo harvest. The life expectancy of a transported convict in a Caribbean plantation colony was not good. Tropical disease and brutal working conditions meant that transportation was not a life sentence in practice so much as a delayed death sentence, one that would arrive at a time and in a manner not of the convict's choosing. The 70 men from Bartholomew Roberts's crew who were sent to work in the slave trade require specific explanation. They were contracted out to the Royal African Company to serve as deckhands on slaving vessels. Slaving ships had the highest mortality rate of any maritime profession in the Atlantic world. Disease and the horrific conditions of the trade meant a significant percentage of white sailors died on each crossing. To be sentenced to the slave trade was to be inserted into one of the most lethal working environments that existed. Branding was another punishment that bridged execution and survival. Convicted pirates who received mercy rather than death were sometimes branded on the cheek or the hand with a hot iron, permanently marked so that any future employer could see at a glance that they were dealing with someone convicted of piracy. In a world where maritime employment was essentially the only option for men who had spent their lives at sea, a brand on the cheek was a career-ending injury. It was a sentence to poverty by another name. Not all pirate punishments came from imperial justice. Pirates developed their own internal disciplinary systems, and the punishments they inflicted on each other were sometimes more inventive and more terrible than what the state provided. The most famous pirate self-punishment was marooning, and its reputation has been thoroughly romanticized by fiction. The reality was considerably bleaker. When a pirate crew voted to maroon one of their own, usually for theft from fellow crew members, cowardice in battle, or bringing a woman aboard disguised as a man, the marooned man was taken to a small island or uninhabited spit of land with no fresh water. He was given a pistol with a single shot and sometimes a bottle of rum. The single shot was explicitly for suicide when the suffering became unbearable. The crew understood and the marooned man understood that this was not a rescue scenario. They would not be coming back. In the tropics, without fresh water, a human being dies of thirst in approximately 3 to 5 days. The tropical sun accelerates the process. The single bullet was not a symbolic gesture. It was a genuine mercy offered in the context of a sentence that had no other mercy in it. The code that governed pirate ships, the Articles, was itself a remarkable document of communal justice. Pirate articles commonly specified punishments for a range of offenses with a specificity that formal law rarely matched. One article from the period specified that anyone guilty of cowardice in battle would be marooned. Another specified that anyone who stole from a fellow crew member would have his ears and nose slit and be set ashore, visibly marked as a thief for the rest of his life. The pirates were not creating a lawless world. They were creating an alternative legal system with its own enforcement mechanisms. Those mechanisms could be extremely violent. The story of pirate punishment has a gender dimension almost completely absent from popular accounts. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the most famous women pirates of the Golden Age. Their story is typically told with a romantic quality. Two women who passed as men, who fought alongside male pirates, who were finally captured in 1720 when Calico Jack Rackham's crew was taken by a Jamaican privateer. The less romantic version begins with what happened in the hours before their capture. Rackham's crew was below decks, drunk, when Captain Jonathan Barnett's vessel came alongside. The trial documents suggest that only Bonny and Read, along with a few others, were willing to fight. The rest of the crew was too intoxicated to come up on deck. There is a story reported in the trial record itself that Mary Read screamed at the men hiding below that they were cowards and that if they had a man's heart among them, they would come up and fight. They did not come up and fight. The vessel was taken. At the trial in Jamaica, all the male members of the crew were convicted and hanged. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were also convicted, but both pleaded their bellies, the legal phrase for announcing they were pregnant. Under English law, a pregnant woman could not be executed until after she had given birth, on the principle that the unborn child was innocent. Both were granted stays of execution. Mary Read died in prison, probably of fever related to her pregnancy. Anne Bonny's fate is one of the genuine mysteries of the era. There is no execution record, no further court record. She appears in the documented history of the Caribbean and then simply disappears from it, and historians have been arguing about what happened to her ever since. The English system was not the only imperial response to piracy, and some of the others were considerably more brutal and far less theatrical. Spain's relationship with Caribbean piracy was complicated by the fact that Spanish colonial authorities could not always distinguish between pirates, unaffiliated criminals, and privateers who were government-licensed criminals from rival powers. This inconvenience Spain navigated by sometimes executing them anyway and arguing about the diplomatic consequences later. The Spanish method of execution was more commonly garroting than hanging. A garroting was strangulation by mechanical means, a metal collar tightened around the condemned person's neck by a screw until they died. It was, in theory, faster than hanging by a short rope. In practice, the efficiency depended on the skill of the executioner and the quality of the equipment, neither of which was guaranteed in a Caribbean colonial port far from the craftsmen who made the devices properly. Botched garrottings were not uncommon, and they were not quick. Spanish colonial governors also had a tradition of simply destroying captured pirate vessels along with everyone on them. Accounts from the period describe Spanish naval vessels setting captured pirate ships on fire with the crew still aboard. And these events are documented in the records of survivors and in diplomatic complaints filed by rival nations, demonstrating that the theatrical quality of English pirate justice was not universal. Some empires simply wanted the problem gone. What emerges from examining how the maritime empires punished pirates is a picture of a deliberate psychological campaign that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. This was not accident. The men who designed these systems understood exactly what they were doing. The short rope that strangled rather than killed quickly created a visible spectacle of prolonged suffering. The gibbet preserved the body for years as a permanent landmark of consequence. The trials held in colonial ports rather than London reached the specific audience that needed frightening. The broadsheets extended the spectacle into populations that would never stand on the Wapping shore. Every element of the system was calculated. What the system could not fully account for was the psychological resilience of the people it was trying to frighten. Sailors in the early 18th century already lived lives of extraordinary risk. Scurvy, shipwreck, tropical disease, naval press gangs, brutal working conditions, and pay routinely stolen by corrupt pursers meant that the life of an honest sailor was not obviously preferable to the life of a pirate. The gallows was a powerful deterrent. It was not an absolute one. For many pirates, the pirate life was the only community they had ever known that treated them with basic dignity. Pirate articles guaranteed a share of the prize proportional to your contribution. Now, pirate ships did not allow officers to flog sailors for trivial infractions. Pirate democracy, however rough, gave ordinary men a voice in decisions that affected their lives. These were things the honest maritime trade did not offer, and the threat of the gibbet competed against them. The men who chose the black flag were not choosing it in ignorance of the consequences. They knew about execution dock. They had probably seen a gibbet. They made their calculation and decided that the life was worth the risk, or that they had no better option, or that they were so far gone in the life that turning back was no longer meaningful. Understanding this does not romanticize piracy. It humanizes the men and women who practiced it in a way that makes the punishments they suffered land with their proper weight. Stand up. The golden age of piracy ended for a variety of interconnected reasons, and the expansion of pirate punishment was central among them. The executions of the early 1720s were particularly decisive. When Bartholomew Roberts was killed and his crew processed through Cape Coast Castle, 52 men hanged in a single proceeding. When Blackbeard was killed off the coast of North Carolina in 1718, his head was suspended from the bowsprit of the vessel that killed him. A deliberate display designed to make clear that there would be no trial, no last speech, no romantic ending. The Royal Navy was no longer interested in the theatrical version of justice. It was interested in the efficient version. By the late 1720s, the combination of military pressure, expanded admiralty jurisdiction, and the systematic execution of captured pirates had reduced the pirate population of the Caribbean and Atlantic to a fraction of what it had been at the Golden Age's peak. The few pirates who continued operating did so in increasingly marginal areas, with smaller crews and smaller prizes. The great days of Bartholomew Roberts and Blackbeard and Calico Jack were gone. What the gibbet could not do was address the underlying conditions that produced pirates in the first place. The brutal working conditions of the legitimate maritime trades, the systematic theft of sailors' wages, the press gangs that stripped men from their lives without consent. All of these remained intact after the Golden Age ended. The men who might have become Blackbeard in 1710 became something else in 1730 because the punishment had become too severe. But the grievances that had made Blackbeard intelligible to his contemporaries did not go away. History taught you about pirates through the romantic version because the romantic version is easier to sell. The hats, the parrots, the treasure, the freedom. It is a good story. But the full story includes the iron cage hanging above the harbor, the body in it, moving in the wind, the smell carried on the salt air, the sailors passing underneath, looking up and looking away. It includes the men who made their calculation and chose the black flag anyway, knowing what waited for them if they lost. The golden age of piracy was not a romantic adventure. It was a war between desperate men and the most powerful institutions on earth, fought on the open water, adjudicated in hasty courts, and concluded on public gallows in front of crowds who went home and told their children what they had seen. That is the history they did not teach you. Now you know it. What part of this surprised you the most? Did you know about the gibbet tradition and how long those bodies were left on display? Leave your perspective in the comments. Every response gets read. If this kind of deep history is what you are here for, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. There is a great deal more that the textbooks left out, and we are going to keep finding it. Stay curious. Stay with us.